A poor girl begs the caged billionaire everyone feared to marry her. But what happens next will leave you speechless. She's desperate to save her dying mother. And he's the richest man in town, trapped behind glass walls and a past too dark to face. Everyone says he's a monster, dangerous, heartless, guilty of the mine explosion that destroyed her family. But when she looks into his eyes, she sees something no one else dares to believe. A broken man begging to be forgiven. Their deal was simple. 1 month, 1 marriage of convenience. But secrets buried in that mansion are about to tear their worlds apart. Because the man she thought would save her mother might be the one who killed her father. Now she has to choose. Walk away from the man everyone hates, or stay and face the truth that could destroy her. So what happens when the poor girl who came to beg for help becomes the only one who can save the man everyone wanted to forget? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The fluorescent lights of Jake's diner buzzed overhead as Lucy Ann Doyle untied her faded blue apron for the last time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded the worn fabric, smoothing out the wrinkles with care despite knowing it didn't matter anymore. The smell of burnt coffee and greasy burgers clung to her uniform, a scent that had become as familiar as her own skin over the past 3 years. "I'm sorry, Lucy," Jake muttered, not quite meeting her eyes as he counted out her final pay in wrinkled bills. "But I can't have my waitresses giving away free meals. Times are tough enough as it is." Lucy nodded, her throat tight. He was a veteran, Jake. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The memory of the old man's weathered face and grateful smile made her chest ache. She didn't regret her decision, even though it had cost her the job she desperately needed. The diner's bell chimed as 2 regulars shuffled in, shaking off the drizzle from their coats. They were miners, their faces still streaked with coal dust from their shift. Lucy gathered her things, trying to make herself invisible as they settled into their usual booth. "Did you hear about Old Man Holloway's son?" One of them whispered, though in the nearly empty diner, his voice carried. "Living up there in that glass cage like some kind of ghost." "Serves him right," his companion replied, "after what happened to our boys in that mine." He lowered his voice further. "Though I heard he's so desperate for company nowadays, he'd probably pay anyone just to talk to him." Lucy's hand froze on her bag. The name Holloway made her stomach churn. It was the same name that had haunted her family for years, ever since the explosion that had taken her father's life along with 11 other miners. The official report had blamed the workers for not following safety protocols, but Lucy knew better. Her father had always been careful, always by the book. The rain had picked up by the time Lucy stepped outside, a fine mist that seemed to seep straight into her bones. The streets of Briar Hollow were nearly empty, storefronts dark and shuttered. Like everything else in this town, they were slowly dying, victims of an economy that had moved on and left them behind. Her shoes splashed through puddles as she walked the familiar route home, past the boarded-up hardware store where her father used to buy his tools, past the church where they'd held his funeral. The streetlights cast weak halos through the drizzle, barely illuminating the cracked sidewalks. When Lucy reached their small house at the end of Maple Street, her heart sank at the sight of the darkened windows. The power must be out again, another bill she couldn't pay. She fumbled with her key in the rusty lock, the porch light flickering weakly above her. "Mama?" she called out softly as she stepped inside. The house was cold and dim, lit only by the battery-operated lantern they kept for emergencies. "Mama, I'm home." A weak cough answered her from the living room. Lucy rushed in to find her mother, Martha, slumped in her wheelchair, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Even in the poor light, Lucy could see the bright spots of blood staining the white fabric. "Oh, Mama." Lucy whispered, kneeling beside the wheelchair. Her mother's face was pale, her breathing labored. "Did you take your medicine?" Martha's hand trembled as she reached out to touch Lucy's cheek. "We're out, sweetheart. I tried to make it last, but—" Another coughing fit racked her thin frame. Lucy's eyes burned with tears as she helped her mother clean up, tucking a worn Afghan around her shoulders. The prescription bottles on the side table were all empty, their labels mocking her with their urgent refill warnings. She knew exactly how much the medication cost. $825 they didn't have. After getting her mother settled in bed, Lucy sat at their small kitchen table, her father's photograph propped up against the salt shaker. In the picture, he was smiling, his face clean and bright, taken just days before the explosion that had changed everything. The newspaper clippings she'd saved were yellow with age now, but the headlines still cut deep. 12 miners dead in Holloway mine disaster, and investigation finds worker negligence to blame. The miner's words from the diner echoed in her mind. The mysterious Holloway heir, locked away in his glass house on the hill, so lonely he might pay for company. Lucy's fingers traced her father's face in the photograph, her heart heavy with the weight of desperation. "What would you think of me now, Daddy?" she whispered to the silence. "Your little girl, considering—" She couldn't finish the thought out loud. The idea of seeking help from a Holloway, from the family responsible for her father's death, made her feel sick. But the image of her mother's blood-stained handkerchief pushed away her pride. Through the kitchen window, she could just make out the silhouette of Holloway Hill in the distance, a dark mass against the cloudy night sky. Somewhere up there, behind walls of glass and steel, was a man who might be her last hope, or her worst mistake. Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up straighter. "I'll find a way, Daddy," she promised the photograph, her voice barely more than a breath. "Even if it means begging a monster." The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting out the moments of her decision. In her mother's room, she could hear the wheeze of labored breathing. The sound strengthened her resolve, even as it broke her heart. Tomorrow she would climb that hill and face whatever, or whoever, waited in that glass house. For her mother, she would swallow her pride and her fear. For her family, she would do whatever it took to survive. The rain continued to fall outside, a gentle percussion against the windows, as Lucy sat in the darkened kitchen, planning her approach to the man on the hill. Each drop seemed to whisper of debts and desperation, of pride and necessity, of monsters and mercy. But mostly they whispered of hope, however faint, however costly it might prove to be. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, with tendrils of fog clinging to the valley like ghostly fingers. Lucy stood at the base of Holloway Hill, clutching her father's worn Bible to her chest. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, its pages dog-eared and marked with her father's neat annotations. She'd grabbed it impulsively before leaving the house, needing something of his to give her strength. The path ahead wound upward through untamed wilderness, what was once a manicured driveway now overtaken by nature. Thick rhododendrons crowded the edges, their leaves dripping with morning dew. Each step crunched on gravel hidden beneath years of fallen leaves. Lucy's worn sneakers were already soaked through from the wet grass. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, though it did little against the autumn chill. The higher she climbed, the more her heart thundered in her chest. What was she doing? Breaking into a billionaire's estate? She was no criminal. She'd never even gotten a parking ticket. But then she thought of her mother's labored breathing this morning, the way her hands shook as she tried to lift a glass of water. Lucy squared her shoulders and pressed on. The mansion emerged from the fog like a sleeping giant. Its stone walls rose 3 stories high, with countless windows staring down at her like vacant eyes. An iron gate, blocked the main entrance, its bars thick with rust. The family crest, two crossed pickaxes beneath a soaring eagle, was barely visible beneath climbing vines. Lucy's fingers trembled as she traced the edge of her father's Bible. He'd worked in these mines for 15 years before the accident. How? Many times had he passed through these same gates, nodding to the security guard in his little booth. Now the booth stood empty, its windows cracked and dark. She skirted the main gate, following the perimeter wall. Her father had once mentioned a servant's entrance around back. The miners had used it during parties, not being worthy of the grand front door. After several minutes of searching, she found it. A simple wooden door set into the stone, its hinges orange with rust. The door creaked open at her touch. Lucy hesitated, her heart in her throat. This was her last chance to turn back, to forget this crazy idea. But then she remembered the empty pill bottles, the unpaid bills, her mother's blood-stained handkerchief. Taking a deep breath, she slipped inside. The service corridor was surprisingly clean, though clearly unused. No dust coated the marble floors, no cobwebs hung in corners. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Lucy's footsteps echoed despite her attempt to walk quietly, each sound making her wince. She passed what must have been the kitchen, gleaming stainless steel visible through the doorway. Everything was immaculate, as if waiting for staff who would never return. The whole place felt frozen in time, preserved like a museum to better days. Sunlight beckoned from the end of the corridor. Lucy followed it, drawn toward its warmth. She emerged into a vast conservatory that took her breath away. Soaring glass walls stretched 2 stories high, filled with tropical plants and flowering vines. A fountain burbled somewhere unseen, its sound mixing with the soft whir of hidden fans. And there, in the center of it all, stood something that made Lucy stop in her tracks. It was like a greenhouse within the greenhouse, a massive glass cube, maybe 40 feet on each side. Golden morning light streamed through its crystal-clear walls, illuminating the space within. That's when she saw him. Ethan Ward Holloway sat in what looked like an expensive wheelchair, his back to her as he faced a grand piano. He was tall, even seated, with broad shoulders and dark hair shot through with silver at the temples. When he turned at the sound of her gasp, Lucy felt the world tilt beneath her feet. His face was a study in contrasts. The right side was classically handsome, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. But the left side bore a network of scars that pulled at his features, marking him as surely as the explosion had marked her life. His eyes were a striking grey, sharp with intelligence, and something else. Something that made Lucy take an instinctive step backward. Her heel caught on a decorative planter. She stumbled, arms windmilling, and knocked over a potted rose bush. The crash seemed deafening in the quiet conservatory. Lucy froze, expecting alarms to blare, security guards to come running. Instead, there was only silence. Then a soft, mechanical hiss as Ethan pressed something on his wheelchair's armrest. A section of the glass wall slid open smoothly, like the door of an elevator. "You're the first trespasser who didn't run," he said quietly. His voice was low and cultured, with an underlying roughness that matched his scars. Lucy clutched her father's Bible tighter, its familiar weight the only thing keeping her from fleeing. She watched as Ethan's gaze dropped to the book in her hands, something flickering in his expression too quickly to read. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls, catching the water droplets on the surrounding plants and turning them to diamonds. In that golden light, Lucy could see every detail of Ethan's face, the way his scars pulled his left eye slightly downward, the tension in his jaw, the careful blankness he tried to maintain. But his eyes gave him away. They held the same haunted look she sometimes caught in her own reflection. The Bible's leather cover was warm and smooth against her palms, grounding her. She thought of her father's favorite passage, marked with a faded ribbon. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. The words gave her strength, even as they reminded her why she was here, why she had to face this man who represented everything she'd lost. The fountain's gentle splashing filled the silence between them. Through the glass walls, the fog continued its slow dance around the mansion, cutting them off from the world beyond. In this strange, suspended moment, it felt like they were the only two people left on earth, the desperate daughter and the scarred heir, facing each other across a gulf built of tragedy and blame. Lucy's heart thundered in her chest as she stood before him. Her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped her father's Bible. I came looking for work," she blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper in the vast conservatory. Ethan's piercing grey eyes studied her, taking in her worn waitress uniform, the scuffed shoes, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Why do you look so desperate?" he asked, his tone neither kind nor cruel, simply curious, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "I'm not—" Lucy started to lie, but her voice cracked. The weight of everything, her mother's illness, the mounting bills, the constant rejection from every business in town, came crashing down. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "My mother's dying," she sobbed, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "She needs care I can't afford. No one in town will hire me because of my father, because he was one of the miners in the explosion." She saw Ethan's hands tighten on his wheelchair's armrests, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "What are you really here for, Miss Doyle? Lucy Doyle." She drew in a shaky breath, knowing what she was about to say was madness. The words felt foreign on her tongue, desperate and wild. "Please marry me." The fountain's gentle splashing seemed deafening in the silence that followed. "I need your insurance to save my mother," she added quickly, her cheeks burning with shame. "I know it sounds crazy, but I don't know what else to do." Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't mock her or call security. Instead, he wheeled his chair closer to the glass wall, those striking grey eyes never leaving her face. "Most people," he said slowly, "would try to charm their way into a wealthy man's life. They'd pretend to care, to understand. But you're remarkably honest about your desperation." Lucy wiped her tears with trembling fingers. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore." "No," he agreed, something softening almost imperceptibly in his expression. "I don't believe you do." He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I don't believe in charity, Miss Doyle. It creates dependency and resentment on both sides. But I do admire honesty. It's become a rare commodity in my experience." He pressed another button on his chair, and a sleek tablet emerged from a hidden compartment. "I have a proposal for you," he said, his fingers moving across the screen. 30 days. You'll stay here at the estate as my live-in companion. If we both survive the month without killing each other, I'll legally marry you. Your mother's medical bills will be covered from day one, and I'll ensure you're both provided for afterward, regardless of what happens between us." Lucy's mind reeled. 30 days? She repeated numbly. "You'll have your own suite, of course," he continued, as if they were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "All meals provided, a clothing allowance, whatever you need to be comfortable. But you'll spend your days here, with me, reading, talking, playing chess, whatever we decide. No running away, no hiding in your room. Real companionship." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Ethan's scarred face turned toward her fully, and for the first time she saw something crack in his careful mask. "Because you're the first person who hasn't treated me like a ghost," he said quietly. "Everyone else who comes here, the doctors, the staff, even my own family, they look through me, around me, anywhere but at me. But you see me, even if what you see frightens you." Lucy's throat tightened. She thought of her mother, getting weaker by the day. She thought of the unopened medical bills piling up on their kitchen table. She thought of her father, who had always taught her to face her fears with courage. "Yes," she whispered. Ethan nodded once, then pressed another button. A panel in the wall slid open, revealing a small room with a desk and chair. "The paperwork is ready," he said. "My lawyers are very efficient." Lucy walked into the room on shaky legs. The contract lay on the desk, thick with legal terms she barely understood. But at the bottom were 2 signature lines, one already bearing Ethan's strong, precise handwriting. She picked up the pen, its weight feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. This was madness, surely. Agreeing to spend 30 days with a stranger, a man who lived in a glass cage, who bore the scars of the same tragedy that had destroyed her family. But when she looked back through the glass wall, she saw something in Ethan's eyes that made her pause. Behind the carefully constructed walls, behind the scars and the wealth and the isolation, she glimpsed a loneliness that matched her own. Her hand trembled as she signed her name beside his, the ink bleeding slightly where her tears fell on the paper. In that moment, with the morning sun streaming through the conservatory's endless glass walls, Lucy Doyle agreed to marry the man her father's death had made her hate, and somehow it felt like both an ending and a beginning. The scratch of her pen echoed in the quiet room, sealing a bargain born of desperation and honesty. When she looked up, Ethan was watching her with an unreadable expression, but his hands had relaxed their grip on his wheelchair's arms. The contract between them was simple in its way, 30 days of truth between 2 broken people, with the hope of salvation at the end. Lucy carefully set down the pen, her signature still glistening on the page. The die was cast. In 30 days, she would either save her mother or lose herself completely. Looking at Ethan through the glass wall, she wondered if perhaps both were possible at the same time. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting delicate shadows across Lucy's face as she stirred from sleep. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the plush, queen-sized bed, her mind struggling to reconcile the elegant surroundings with her memories of home. The guest room at Holloway Estate stretched before her, easily 3 times the size of her bedroom back home. Lucy padded to the window, drawing back heavy drapes to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Morning mist clung to the treetops like cotton candy, and in the distance she could make out the tiny shapes of houses in Briar Hollow. Somewhere down there her mother was waking up too, probably wondering if yesterday had been a dream. A gentle knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," Lucy called, pulling her borrowed robe tighter around herself. A woman in her early 60s entered, carrying a neat stack of folded clothes. Her silver hair was pulled back in a precise bun, and her crisp navy uniform screamed efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Doyle. I'm Mrs. Helen Cheney, Mr. Holloway's nurse." She set the clothes on a nearby chair. "I trust you slept well?" Lucy nodded, trying not to fidget under the older woman's appraising gaze. "Yes, thank you. The room is lovely." "Good." Mrs. Cheney's expression softened slightly. "I've brought you some clothes that should fit. We'll arrange for a proper wardrobe later. Now, shall we discuss Mr. Holloway's schedule?" Lucy perched on the edge of the bed, while Mrs. Cheney remained standing, straight-backed and professional. "Mr. Holloway begins his day at 7 o'clock sharp with physical therapy. Breakfast follows at 8:30, after which he spends most mornings in the greenhouse. Lunch is at 12:30, followed by rest or work in his study. Evening therapy is at 4 o'clock, dinner at 6:30. The nurse's voice took on a more serious tone. His therapy routine is crucial. While in the greenhouse, he needs assistance with tools and materials, but never attempt to enter the glass enclosure without his express permission. The environment inside is carefully controlled for his condition. Lucy's fingers twisted in the soft fabric of her robe. His condition, may I ask? That's for Mr. Holloway to discuss if he chooses. Mrs. Cheney cut her off firmly, but not unkindly. For now, focus on learning the routine. I'll show you to the greenhouse after you've dressed and had breakfast. The greenhouse was a marvel of engineering and beauty. Sunlight streamed through countless glass panels, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. In the center, Ethan's glass enclosure gleamed like a jewel box, surrounded by flourishing plants and flowers. Lucy found him already at work, his wheelchair positioned near a potting bench. He barely glanced up as she entered. There are gardening gloves in the drawer to your left. Put them on and bring me the bag of potting soil. She complied, noting how his hands moved with precise efficiency despite their slight tremor. For the next few hours, she followed his terse instructions, fetching tools and materials as he carefully repotted orchids and tended to various plants. No, not that trowel, he snapped when she handed him the wrong tool. The smaller one. Do you need me to draw you a picture? Lucy bit back a retort, reminding herself why she was here. But as the morning wore on, she began to notice things. The way his shoulders tensed when he had to ask for help. How his eyes lingered on the plants he couldn't quite reach. The careful way he hid his frustration behind sharp words. At lunch, served in a small dining room adjacent to the greenhouse, Ethan surprised her by asking, "That Bible you brought yesterday, was it yours?" Lucy pushed her salad around her plate. "It was my father's." "You believe in God, then?" She kept her eyes on her food. "I used to." "Used to?" His tone was probing, almost challenging. "I'd rather not discuss it," Lucy said quietly but firmly. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and returned to his meal. That evening, Lucy sat in her room with a laptop Mrs. Cheney had provided, her heart pounding as she waited for her mother to answer her video call. When Martha Doyle's tired face appeared on screen, Lucy had to fight back tears. "Lucy, oh sweetheart, where are you? Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama," Lucy assured her, angling the camera so her mother couldn't see too much of the luxurious room. "Everything's going to be okay now. I found a job, a really good one, with benefits. We'll be able to get your medicine again." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "But where are you staying? You look different somehow." "It's part of the job," Lucy explained carefully. "I'm living in as a companion. The pay is excellent and they're taking care of everything." It wasn't exactly a lie, she told herself. "Oh, Lucy." Her mother's voice cracked. "You're so much like your father, always taking care of everyone else. I wish—" "Don't worry about me, Mama," Lucy interrupted gently. "Just focus on getting stronger. I'll visit as soon as I can." After ending the call, Lucy sat in the growing darkness, her chest tight with guilt and worry. The sound of piano music drifting through the halls pulled her from her thoughts. Curious, she followed the melancholy notes. The music led her to a dimly lit corridor near Ethan's private quarters. Through a partially open door, she could see him at a grand piano, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. The tune was simple but haunting, played with careful precision rather than flowing naturally. Every few measures he would pause, his hands trembling slightly before continuing. Lucy stood in the shadows, watching. Gone was the sharp-tongued man from the greenhouse. In his place sat someone else entirely, someone struggling to reclaim something lost, someone lonely enough to play piano in the dark The pity hit her like a physical force, catching her off guard. This wasn't the monster she'd imagined, the cruel billionaire she'd been prepared to hate. This was just a man, as broken in his way as she was in hers. Downstairs in his glass room, Ethan sat in the darkness, watching the faint reflection of Lucy's retreat in the glass walls. His fingers still tingled from the piano keys, an echo of what they'd once been capable of. "She's not like the others," he whispered to the empty room, surprised by the hope in his own voice. The glass walls reflected his words back to him, multiplying them like ripples in still water, while outside the valley disappeared into the gathering night. The morning sun filtered through the conservatory's glass panels, casting warm rectangles of light across the breakfast table. Lucy sat across from Ethan, the morning's newspaper rustling between them. Steam curled up from their coffee cups, and the scent of fresh-baked bread filled the air. "Would you mind?" Ethan gestured toward the newspaper, his hand trembling more noticeably than usual. "My eyes aren't cooperating this morning." Lucy nodded, picking up the paper. She began reading about local developments, market updates, and weather forecasts. As she read, she couldn't help but notice how Ethan's tremors seemed worse today. His coffee cup rattled against its saucer when he tried to lift it. "There are some letters I need to dictate as well," he said after she finished the paper. "My hands." He flexed his fingers, frustration flickering across his scarred face. "They're not as reliable as they once were." "Of course," Lucy replied, reaching for a notepad and pen. As they worked through the correspondence, Lucy found herself studying the walls of his office. Awards and certificates lined the dark wood paneling, their golden frames catching the morning light. One plaque in particular caught her eye. "Ethan Ward Holloway, CEO of Holloway Mining Corporation, Business Leader of the Year." The name hit her like a physical blow. Holloway Mining Corporation. The words echoed in her mind, stirring something deep and painful. After finishing the letters, Lucy excused herself, her thoughts churning. That afternoon, while dusting the study's shelves, her hands trembling slightly, she came across a framed photograph that made her heart stop. The photo showed a group of miners standing proudly with their shovels, covered in coal dust but smiling. And there, in the middle of the group, was a face she knew better than her own, her father's face. He looked younger, happier, his eyes bright with life and purpose. The date on the photo's corner was just 2 weeks before the explosion. Lucy's legs gave out, and she sank into a nearby chair. The explosion. The one that had killed 12 men, including her father. The one that had destroyed not just her family, but 11 others. And all this time, she'd been living under the same roof as the man responsible. Tears blurred her vision as memories flooded back. Her mother's screams when they got the news, the empty chair at their dinner table, the way their neighbors started looking at them with pity and whispered about the mining disaster families. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Lucy stormed toward the conservatory, the photo clutched in her shaking hands. She found Ethan in his glass room, tending to his orchids. "You!" Her voice cracked with emotion. "It was you all along." Ethan turned, his expression guarded. "What are you talking about?" Lucy held up the photo, pressing it against the glass wall that separated them. "My father, Thomas Doyle. He worked for you. He died in your mine." Recognition dawned in Ethan's eyes, followed by something darker, more haunted. "You destroyed my family." Lucy's voice rose with the storm building outside. 12 men died that day. 12! And you've been sitting here in your mansion, in your fancy glass cage, while their families struggled to survive. Rain began pelting the conservatory roof as Ethan slowly wheeled his chair closer to the glass. His face was ash-white, his eyes hollow with an ancient pain. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. Every one of their names is carved into my memory. Thomas Doyle, Michael Henderson, James Martinez. He recited each name with careful precision, as if they were prayers. "Stop it!" Lucy pressed her hands against her ears. "You don't get to say their names." "I've been living in this cage ever since that day," Ethan continued, his voice raw. "Maybe God sent you to finish what the fire started." Lucy stared at him, tears streaming down her face. The man before her wasn't the monster she'd imagined, but somehow that made it worse. He was just a man, broken, guilty, punishing himself in ways she hadn't even considered. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She turned and ran, barely aware of where she was going. The rain soaked through her clothes as she burst out of the conservatory. Her feet carried her to the rose garden, where she collapsed among the thorny bushes. Thunder rolled across the mountains, matching the storm in her heart. The roses swayed in the wind, their petals scattering like tears around her as she sobbed. For her father, for her family, for all the years of struggle and pain. Above her, the mountains disappeared into dark clouds, and the rain continued to fall, mixing with her tears until she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Lucy lay in her bed, staring at the ornate ceiling as moonlight filtered through the gauzy curtains. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face in that old photograph, smiling and full of life, unaware of the fate that awaited him. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its deep resonance echoing through the empty corridors. Lucy pushed herself up, her bare feet touching the cold, hardwood floor. She moved to the window, watching as clouds drifted across the moon, casting shifting shadows over the estate grounds. Memories flooded her mind, her father's calloused hands teaching her how to plant tomatoes in their small garden, his infectious laugh during Sunday dinners, the way he'd sing old country songs while getting ready for his morning shift. The last kiss he'd placed on her forehead before heading to work that fatal day. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in pale pinks and purples, Lucy began methodically packing her few belongings into her worn duffel bag. Her hands trembled as she folded her clothes, each movement weighted with the gravity of her decision. She couldn't stay here, couldn't break bread with the man responsible for her father's death. The morning light was growing stronger when she finally zipped up her bag. Lucy took one last look around the luxurious guest room that had been her home for the past few days. It felt like a lifetime ago that she'd arrived here, desperate and hoping for salvation. She quietly made her way down the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. But as she reached for the front door handle, a gentle voice stopped her. "Miss Doyle." Lucy turned to find Mrs. Cheney, Ethan's nurse, standing in the foyer. The older woman's face held neither judgment nor surprise, just quiet understanding. "Before you go," Mrs. Cheney said, reaching into her pocket, "I think you should see this." She held out a piece of paper. Lucy took it hesitantly. It was a medical receipt from St. Mary's Hospital, marked paid in full. Her mother's name was at the top, along with a list of treatments and medications that would keep her comfortable for months to come. "He arranged it last night," Mrs. Cheney explained softly, "after you ran out." Lucy's hands shook as she stared at the receipt. The amount paid was more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Her vision blurred with unexpected tears. "He's not asking you to stay," Mrs. Cheney continued. "The money is yours either way, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the hardest cage to break isn't made of glass. Lucy's mind raced. Walking away would be easier. She could take care of her mother, start fresh somewhere else, let her anger and grief remain intact and justified. But standing there, holding evidence of an act of kindness from the man she'd wanted to hate, she realized something profound. Hatred had already claimed one life in that glass room. Would she let it claim another? After a long moment, Lucy set her bag down. "I need to see him." She found Ethan in the conservatory, just as the morning sun was streaming through the glass panels. He sat in his wheelchair, facing the eastern windows, his silhouette dark against the golden light. He didn't turn when she entered, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Lucy's footsteps echoed on the tile floor as she approached the glass enclosure. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm staying," she said softly. "But not for you. For my father's memory." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he still didn't turn. "Why?" "Because he taught me that living with hatred only hurts yourself." Lucy's voice caught. "And I think he'd want me to remember that." Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, relief visible in the way his hands unclenched from his wheelchair's armrests. The days that followed settled into a new routine, different from before. During their therapy sessions, Lucy helped guide Ethan's trembling hands through his exercises, her touch professional but no longer distant. She learned to read the signs of his pain, the tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched, and adjusted her assistance accordingly. The physical therapy was demanding. Ethan's injuries from the mining accident had left him with limited mobility and persistent tremors. Lucy helped him stretch his fingers, massage his joints, and practice gripping objects. Sometimes, when the tremors were particularly bad, she would hold his hand steady so he could sign important documents. In the afternoons, while Ethan rested, Lucy found herself drawn to the estate's gardens. Years of minimal maintenance had left them wild and overgrown, but she could see the bones of what must have once been a beautiful space. She started small, clearing weeds from around the rose bushes, pruning dead branches, and carefully nurturing new growth. There was something therapeutic about working with the roses. Each thorn she carefully navigated reminded her of the painful memories she was learning to handle. Every new bud represented possibility, hope emerging from the tangles of the past. One evening, as the sun was setting, Lucy knelt beside a particularly stubborn rose bush. Her hands were dirty, and there were scratches on her arms, but the satisfaction of seeing new growth made it worthwhile. The roses were starting to respond to her care, their stems straightening, their leaves greening. Looking at her work, Lucy felt the weight of understanding settle over her. These gardens, like her heart, needed more than just clearing away the dead things. They needed patience, care, and the courage to let new life take root. She touched a newly opened rose, its petals soft against her fingertips. "I forgive you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "Maybe that's how I can forgive him too." The words hung in the air, a quiet truth that felt both terrifying and freeing. Behind her, the mansion's windows glowed warm against the deepening twilight, and somewhere inside, a man sat in his glass room, perhaps seeking his own path to forgiveness. The days flowed into each other like watercolors on wet paper. Lucy found herself settling into a rhythm at Holloway Estate, her footsteps no longer hesitant on the polished floors. The mansion's vast rooms, which had first felt so imposing, now held a familiar comfort. Even the constant hum of the glass room's climate control system had become a soothing background noise. One quiet morning, as sunlight streamed through the conservatory windows, Lucy arranged fresh flowers in a vase while Ethan worked on his tablet. The silence between them had grown comfortable, no longer charged with unspoken accusations. "My mother used to grow marigolds," Lucy said suddenly, surprising herself. She hadn't meant to speak, but the memory had surfaced like a bubble breaking the water's surface. Dad built her these little wooden boxes for the windowsills. Every spring they'd burst with orange and yellow blooms. Ethan looked up, his grey eyes softening. "Did she teach you about gardening?" "Some." Lucy adjusted a stem. "But mostly I learned from watching. She always said flowers were God's way of painting hope into the world." She paused, then added softly, "She still believes that, even now. Your mother's faith seems unshakable." Ethan observed, his voice careful. Lucy nodded, moving to water the indoor plants. "Even after Dad died, she never lost it. Sometimes I wonder if I inherited her strength or her faith at all." "You have both," Ethan said quietly. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." Over the next few days, Lucy found herself sharing more stories about the time her father taught her to ride a bike, about Sunday picnics after church, about the way her mother's hands would shake, but never spill a drop while pouring communion wine. Each memory felt like a stone being lifted from her heart. Ethan listened, really listened, in a way that made Lucy realize how long it had been since anyone had truly heard her. Sometimes he'd ask questions, his curiosity genuine, his eyes following her as she moved around his glass room. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled across the mountains, Ethan broke his own silence. "I was in my office when it happened," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. Lucy froze, knowing instantly what he meant. "The explosion. I'd been warned about the equipment. The safety reports were on my desk, but I was focused on quarterly profits." Lucy's hand stilled on the book she'd been shelving. She didn't turn, giving him space to continue. 12 men. His voice cracked. 12 families destroyed because I couldn't be bothered to read a report. Your father." He trailed off, his hands trembling more than usual. "The night it happened," he continued after a long pause, "I drove to the site. The smoke was still rising. I could hear the sirens, see the lights. I walked into the tunnel, wanting to help, to do something. That's when the second collapse happened." Lucy turned then, seeing the raw pain etched across his scarred face. "The doctors said I was lucky to survive, but surviving was the worst punishment of all." Ethan's eyes met hers. 3 months later, I took a bottle of pills. Mrs. Cheney found me. After that, I built this." He gestured to the glass room. "I thought if I couldn't end my life, I could at least remove myself from it." Lucy moved closer, her heart aching despite herself. "The glass room was your penance." "My prison," he corrected. "Self-imposed, but no less real." The days continued to pass. Lucy noticed small changes in Ethan, the way he'd sometimes smile at her jokes, how he'd ask her opinion on business decisions, the determined way he worked through his therapy exercises. His tremors were still bad, but his spirit seemed stronger. One sunny afternoon, Lucy was in the garden, carefully pruning the rose bushes that were finally showing signs of revival. She heard the soft whir of Ethan's wheelchair behind her. "The garden's coming back to life," he observed, looking at the new growth. Lucy wiped her brow, leaving a smudge of dirt. It just needed someone to believe in it again. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. Then, his voice hesitant, he asked, "Do you believe a man like me could ever be redeemed?" Lucy set down her pruning shears, considering the question carefully. She looked at the roses, at how they were reaching toward the light despite years of neglect. "If you're still asking," she said softly, "maybe you already are." That evening, Lucy was heading to her room when something made her pause at the conservatory door. There, in the dim light, stood Ethan, outside his glass room for the first time since she'd arrived. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his legs trembling with the effort of standing, but he was upright. Their eyes met across the space between them. "Maybe," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The cage was never made of glass. Lucy stood frozen, watching as he took one shaky step, then another. She didn't move to help him, somehow knowing that this moment needed to be his alone. In the quiet of the conservatory, surrounded by the plants they'd tended together, something shifted between them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was something just as powerful. Possibility. The days flowed together like watercolors on canvas, each one bringing subtle changes to life at Holloway Estate. Lucy noticed how Ethan's shoulders gradually relaxed, how his face softened when she entered the room. The sharp edges of his wit remained, but now they came with the ghost of a smile. "You don't have to eat in there, you know," Lucy said one morning, watching him pick at his breakfast inside the glass room. She set down a fresh pot of coffee on the table outside. "The weather's perfect today." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I suppose my self-imposed exile is getting a bit ridiculous." "Just a bit," she teased, pulling out a chair. "The staff probably forgot what you look like in natural light." He wheeled himself to the glass door, hesitating only briefly before pressing the button to open it. Lucy pretended not to notice his moment of uncertainty, instead busying herself with pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Mrs. Reynolds nearly fainted yesterday when you said good morning to her," Lucy mentioned, referring to the elderly housekeeper who'd worked at the estate for 20 years. "Did she? I thought she looked rather pale." Ethan chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine, though that might have been shock at seeing me venture all the way to the kitchen. Day by day, meal by meal, Lucy coaxed him further from his glass sanctuary. She noticed how the staff began to linger longer in rooms where he was present, their faces bright with cautious hope. Even Mrs. Cheney, usually so stern and professional, seemed to walk with a lighter step. One afternoon, while they sat in the garden, Lucy pulled out her father's worn Bible. The leather was soft from years of handling, the pages dog-eared and marked with her father's neat annotations. "Would you mind?" she asked carefully. "If I read aloud?" Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Planning to save my soul, Miss Doyle?" "Just sharing something important to me," she replied, opening to one of her father's favorite passages. "Well then," he said, settling back in his wheelchair. "Who am I to refuse? Though I should warn you, I doubt I'm on God's favorite list these days." Lucy began to read, her voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. She chose Psalms, knowing their poetry spoke of both struggle and hope. As she read, she noticed Ethan's eyes close, his face peaceful for once. These quiet moments became part of their routine. Sometimes they'd discuss the passages, Ethan's questions sharp but genuine. Other times they'd sit in comfortable silence, letting the words settle around them like falling leaves. The real change came when Lucy received news about her mother's improving condition. The new medication was working, and Martha's strength was returning. Lucy's joy was infectious, lighting up the entire mansion. "Would you like to meet her?" Lucy asked Ethan one evening. "She's well enough for a short visit now." Fear flickered across his face. "I'm not sure that's wise. After what I did—" "She knows who you are," Lucy interrupted gently. "And she still wants to meet you." The day Martha visited, sunshine streamed through the conservatory windows as if nature itself approved. Lucy helped her mother's wheelchair through the door, watching Ethan's face carefully. He sat straight-backed in his own chair, tension visible in every line of his body. Martha Doyle, though frail, carried herself with quiet dignity. Her eyes, so like Lucy's, took in everything. The glass room, the flourishing plants, and most of all, the man before her. "Mr. Holloway," she said warmly, "thank you for welcoming me into your home." Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Doyle, None of that now, Martha interrupted, reaching out to take his trembling hand. The past is heavy enough without dragging it into this beautiful garden. Lucy watched in amazement as her mother spoke to Ethan with the same gentle authority she'd used when Lucy was a child. She asked about the roses, commented on the light in the conservatory, and somehow got Ethan talking about his own mother's love of gardenias. Before they left, Martha placed her hand on Ethan's cheek, the way she used to do with Lucy's father. "You're carrying too much, son," she said softly. "God's grace is bigger than your guilt." That evening, after settling her mother back at home, Lucy returned to find music floating through the mansion. Following the sound, she paused outside Ethan's room. The melody from his piano was different from the haunting tunes she'd heard before. This one had hope in it, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. She stood listening, not wanting to interrupt. The notes weren't perfect, his hand still shook too much for that, but there was a determination in the music that brought tears to her eyes. The next morning, Lucy found Ethan in the physical therapy room. He was gripping the parallel bars, his knuckles white with effort. As she watched, he slowly pushed himself up from his wheelchair. "Careful," she said, moving closer. "Just give me a moment," he breathed, concentrating intensely. For 3 seconds, Lucy counted them in her thundering heart, he stood unassisted. His legs shook violently, but he was standing. The joy on his face made him look years younger. When his strength gave out, Lucy was there to help him back to his chair, her hands steady and sure. "You're getting stronger," she whispered, still holding his arm. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Only because you make me want to be." The morning newspaper landed on the mansion's doorstep with a dull thud. Lucy bent to pick it up, then froze. There, splashed across the front page of the Briar Hollow Gazette, was a grainy photo of her walking through the Holloway Estate gardens. The headline screamed, "Local waitress weds reclusive billionaire, love or money?" Her hands trembled as she scanned the article. Words jumped out at her. Gold digger, suspicious timing, daughter of deceased miner. The reporter had dug deep, unearthing details about her firing from the diner, her mother's medical bills, even her father's connection to the mining disaster. Mrs. Cheney appeared beside her, trying to snatch the paper away. "Don't read that trash, dear. People always talk when they don't understand." But Lucy couldn't stop reading. The article quoted several townspeople, including her former boss at the diner. "That girl's got nerve," he'd said. "Marrying the man responsible for her daddy's death. Guess money speaks louder than blood." Inside the mansion, Lucy found Ethan already awake in his study, his laptop open. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed. "I tried to keep them away," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Lucy. I should have known they'd find out." "It's not your fault," she replied, but her voice cracked. Throughout the day, reporters gathered at the gates like vultures. Their cameras flashed whenever anyone entered or left the property. Lucy watched from an upstairs window as they accosted the grocery delivery driver, hungry for any scrap of information about the mysterious marriage. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends and neighbors. Some were concerned, others accusatory. Martha called, worried about the attention, but Lucy assured her everything was fine. She didn't mention the social media posts she'd seen, calling her a traitor to her father's memory. That evening, while helping Ethan with his exercises, she noticed him checking his phone more frequently than usual. "Stop reading those articles," she said firmly, taking the device from his trembling hands. "They're right about one thing," he muttered. "You shouldn't be here. Your reputation—" "My reputation?" Lucy interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "The town decided what they thought of me the day my father died. Nothing's changed except now I'm helping someone instead of just surviving. Dinner that night was a tense affair. Usually they ate in comfortable silence or shared light conversation about the garden's progress. But tonight, the weight of public judgment hung heavy between them. Finally, Ethan set down his fork. "We could end this arrangement early," he offered. "Get you and your mother set up somewhere else, away from all this." Lucy stared at him, hurt blooming in her chest. "Is that what you want?" "Of course not," he admitted softly. "But I've already ruined your father's life. I can't bear to ruin yours too. People only remember the worst version of you," Lucy said, reaching across the table to still his fidgeting hands. "They see the man who owned the mine, the recluse in his glass cage, but I see the man still fighting to live, the one who pays attention when I read scripture, who tends roses despite trembling hands, who made sure my mother got the best medical care available." Ethan's eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "I've scheduled the surgery." Lucy's breath caught. They'd discussed the experimental spinal procedure before, a dangerous operation that might help restore some function to his damaged nervous system. The risks were enormous. "Next week," he continued. "The specialists are flying in from Europe. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure." "Why now?" she whispered. His smile was faint but real. "Because for the first time in years I want more than just existence. I want to walk in that garden without help. I want to play piano properly again. I want—" He stopped, looking away. Lucy understood what he couldn't say. He wanted a chance at real life, not just survival. That night, after dinner, Lucy found herself kneeling beside her bed, hands clasped like she used to do as a child. Prayer hadn't come easily since her father's death. Each attempt felt like speaking into void, words echoing back empty and hollow. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't praying for herself. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know I've been angry. I know I've questioned your plan. But please, please watch over him during this surgery. He's trying so hard to find his way back to light." A soft knock interrupted her prayer. Ethan stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane. In the dim light, his scars seemed to fade, leaving just the man beneath. "I heard you praying," he said quietly. Would you mind if I joined you?" Lucy moved over, making space beside her at the bedside. Together they bowed their heads, and she continued her prayer. She prayed for steady hands for the surgeons, for healing, for courage. As her words filled the quiet room, she felt Ethan's hand find hers, gripping it like a lifeline. "Amen," she finished softly. When she looked up, tears were streaming down Ethan's face. "I haven't prayed since the accident," he confessed. "Didn't think I had the right. Didn't think anyone was listening. And now—" He squeezed her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe faith isn't gone after all." In that moment, with moonlight streaming through the window and the weight of his hand in hers, Lucy realized something important. Sometimes the path to healing isn't what we expect. Sometimes it takes a broken marriage contract, a garden full of roses, and the courage to pray again. The reporters might still be at the gates, and the town might still whisper, but here in this quiet room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the trembling hope in Ethan's voice and the way he held onto her hand like it was anchoring him to earth. "We should both get some rest," she said gently. "It's been a long day." Ethan nodded, slowly releasing her hand. As he made his way to the door, he paused. "Lucy." "Yes. Thank you for seeing more than the worst in me." After he left, Lucy stayed kneeling for a long time, her father's worn Bible open in her lap. Outside, the roses swayed in the night breeze, their petals catching moonlight like silent prayers reaching toward heaven. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Lucy paced the worn linoleum floor, her shoes making soft, squeaking sounds with each turn. 6 hours had passed since they'd wheeled Ethan into surgery, and every minute felt like an eternity. She found herself drawn to the small chapel, tucked away in a quiet corner of the hospital. The wooden pews, smooth from years of worried hands, offered a strange comfort. Stained glass windows cast patches of colored light across the floor, and the air held the familiar scent of beeswax candles. Lucy sank into the front pew, pulling her mother's rosary from her pocket. The well-worn beads felt warm against her fingers as she traced their familiar path. Martha had insisted she take it today, pressing it into her hands with a knowing smile. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I've asked for so much already, but please, please let him come through this." The words caught in her throat as tears threatened to fall. "He's trying so hard to find his way back to light, to hope, to you." Hours ticked by as Lucy alternated between prayer and pacing. She thought about the garden they'd tended together, how Ethan's hands had grown steadier with each passing day. She remembered the way his eyes lit up when he managed to stand unassisted, even if just for a few seconds. Finally, at 8:45 in the evening, the surgeon appeared in his blue scrubs, looking tired but satisfied. "Mrs. Holloway?" The name still felt strange to Lucy's ears. She stood on shaky legs. "Yes? The surgery was successful. Your husband is stable, but he's in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Relief made Lucy's knees weak. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded, leading her through maze-like corridors to the intensive care unit. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of Ethan lying there, surrounded by beeping machines. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Lucy pulled a chair close to his bedside, careful not to disturb any of the tubes or wires. She took his hand, noticing how cold his fingers felt against hers. "Hey," she said softly. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here." She squeezed his hand gently. "The roses are probably missing you already. You should see how tall the yellow ones have grown, reaching right up to the glass roof of the conservatory. Through the night, Lucy kept her vigil. She told him stories about the mountain rain, how it made music against the greenhouse windows. She described the way morning fog rolled through the valley like a river of clouds. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, hoping somewhere in the darkness of his mind he could hear her. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting equipment. They offered Lucy coffee and kind smiles, but she barely noticed them. Her world had narrowed to the rise and fall of Ethan's chest and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan's fingers twitched in hers. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. "Lucy?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," she said, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "I'm right here." His grip on her hand tightened. "You gave me back my life," he murmured, the words slurred with medication but full of emotion. Lucy pressed her lips to his knuckles, too overwhelmed to speak. For a moment, everything felt perfect, like a prayer answered, like hope fulfilled. But life has a way of shattering perfect moments. The next morning, while Lucy was getting coffee from the hospital cafeteria, her phone exploded with notifications. Her hands shook as she opened the first message, a link to a news article with her picture splashed across the screen. "Scandal at Holloway Estate. Daughter of deceased miner marries billionaire for money." The article detailed everything: her father's death in the mine explosion, her desperate financial situation, even snippets of conversation from the diner where she'd first heard about Ethan. Someone had done their research, turning their story into something ugly and calculating. Lucy's phone rang. It was Mrs. Cheney, Ethan's nurse. "Lucy, you need to come back to the estate right away. There's a situation." When Lucy arrived, her heart nearly stopped. The iron gates had been spray-painted with cruel words. Rocks had shattered several greenhouse windows, and angry protesters lined the road, holding signs that called her a traitor to her father's memory. Mrs. Cheney met her at the service entrance, face tight with worry. "It's not safe for you here, dear. They're getting more aggressive by the hour. But Ethan is still in the hospital, thank goodness. But you need to leave, at least until things calm down." Lucy knew she was right. With shaking hands, she packed a small bag, trying not to look at the protesters through the windows. As she drove away, their shouts followed her like curses. Back at the hospital, Ethan was awake and watching the news on the small room TV. His face was ashen as images of the vandalized estate flashed across the screen. "Lucy," he said when she entered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." She tried to smile, but tears betrayed her. "It's not your fault. People they don't understand. You have to go," he said, though each word seemed to cause him pain. "It's not safe for you here. I don't want to leave you. Please." His hand found hers, squeezing with what little strength he had. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Lucy looked at their intertwined fingers, remembering all the moments that had led them here. The broken girl sneaking into his greenhouse, the man trapped in his glass cage, the gradual thawing of two frozen hearts. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "I'll come back," she promised. But as she turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Don't go back to the dark, Lucy," he murmured, his words heavy with meaning. "Please." She paused in the doorway, wanting to say something. Anything. But words failed her. Instead, she clutched her mother's rosary tight in her pocket and walked away, leaving behind the man who had somehow become her chance at redemption, even as she had become his. Through the hospital windows, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain. Lucy thought of their garden, of roses drinking in the coming storm, growing stronger despite the broken glass around them. Sometimes, she realized, love was like that too, finding ways to bloom even in the midst of destruction. The autumn wind whispered through the streets of Briar Hollow, scattering golden leaves across Lucy's path as she walked to work. 3 weeks had passed since she'd left the Holloway mansion, though sometimes it felt like 3 years. The small bell above Rosemary's flower shop chimed as she pushed open the door, greeting her with its familiar ring. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Lucy called out to her elderly employer, who was arranging pink carnations in the front window. "Oh, Lucy, dear, just in time. We've got a wedding order to prepare." Lucy tied on her green apron, grateful for the work that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering. Mrs. Henderson had hired her despite the gossip, saying she didn't put stock in town rumors. The old woman's kindness was like a balm to Lucy's wounded spirit. The morning passed in a blur of ribbon and roses. Lucy's fingers moved automatically, creating bouquets while her thoughts drifted to other flowers, the ones she'd tended in a glass-walled garden under the watchful eyes of a man who'd changed her life. Around noon, the mail carrier pushed a thin envelope through the shop's mail slot. Lucy picked it up, noticing it had no return address. Inside was a carefully folded newspaper clipping, its edges crisp as though someone had handled it with great care. The headline made her heart skip. Holloway Mining Corporation sold. Billionaire CEO creates multi-million-dollar fund for miners' families. Lucy's hands trembled as she read further. Ethan had sold his entire company, using the proceeds to establish the Holloway Healing Fund. The article detailed how the fund would provide medical care, education, and financial support to families affected by mining accidents across Appalachia. "He did it?" she whispered, touching the words as though to make sure they were real. "He really did it." The article quoted an anonymous source close to Holloway. "This isn't about publicity or making amends. It's about acknowledging the past and creating something meaningful for the future." Lucy knew those words were meant for her. This was Ethan's way of making peace, not just with her father's death, but with all the guilt he'd carried for so long. He'd turned his cage of shame into a foundation of hope. That evening, after her shift ended, Lucy found herself walking toward St. Michael's Church. The old stone building stood silent against the darkening sky, its stained glass windows glowing softly from within. She slipped inside, the familiar scent of beeswax candles and aged wood wrapping around her like a comfortable blanket. The church was empty except for an elderly woman praying in the front pew. Lucy made her way to the votive candle stand, fishing in her pocket for $1. She lit a single candle, watching the flame dance in the dim light. "Wherever you are," she whispered, thinking of Ethan's grey eyes and scarred hands, "I hope you're free." The words felt like both a prayer and a confession. As she walked home in the gathering dusk, memories flooded back. The way Ethan's face had lit up when he first stood without support, how his piano playing had grown stronger each day, the quiet conversations they'd shared over cups of tea. She wondered if he still played, if his hands were steady enough now to create the beautiful melodies she remembered. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Lucy was preparing breakfast for her mother when a knock at the door startled them both. A courier stood on their worn front porch, holding a cream-colored envelope. "Delivery for Lucy Doyle," he said, handing her the envelope with a polite nod. Lucy's heart raced as she recognized the handwriting. Elegant despite its slight tremor, unmistakably Ethan's. She closed the door and leaned against it, gathering courage before opening the letter. The paper was thick, expensive, and the ink was deep blue. His words flowed across the page. "Dear Lucy, I found freedom when you walked through my door, not just from the glass walls I'd built around myself, but from the prison of guilt I'd lived in for so long. You showed me that redemption isn't earned through punishment, but through choosing to live and love again. If you can, come to the place where the roses bloom again. Yours, Ethan." Lucy pressed the letter to her chest, feeling tears spring to her eyes. Her mother watched from her wheelchair, a knowing smile on her face. "Go," Martha said softly. "You've been half alive since you left that place. Whatever happens, you need to know." Lucy looked at her mother, saw the strength and wisdom in her eyes. "But what about you?" "I'm doing better than I have in years, thanks to you. And him. The nurse. Comes every day, and I've got my shows to keep me company." Martha reached for Lucy's hand. "Sometimes love requires a leap of faith, sweetheart. Your father taught me that." Outside, the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Lucy folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket, its weight like a promise against her heart. The roses were calling her home, and this time, she wasn't running away from the truth. She was running toward it. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and possibility. Somewhere on Holloway Hill, a garden waited, its flowers reaching towards the sky, no longer contained by walls of glass, but free to grow wild and beautiful, just like the love that had bloomed there against all odds. The morning air held a crisp bite as Lucy's old pickup truck wound its way up Holloway Hill. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The familiar road seemed different now, wilder, more alive. Where once meticulously maintained hedges had stood sentinel, nature had begun to reclaim its territory. Wildflowers dotted the hillside in patches of purple, yellow, and white. Black-eyed Susans nodded in the breeze alongside clusters of mountain laurel. The sight brought tears to Lucy's eyes. These weren't the carefully cultivated blooms she remembered, but something more honest, more real. As she rounded the final bend, the Holloway mansion came into view. Her breath caught in her throat. The imposing iron gates that had once seemed so forbidding stood wide open, their elaborate H monogram partially hidden behind climbing morning glories. It was as if the estate itself was extending an invitation. Lucy parked near the front steps, her truck looking out of place against the grand facade. Yet somehow, the mansion's perfectly maintained exterior felt less intimidating than before. Perhaps it was the window boxes overflowing with cheerful petunias, or the way sunshine gleamed warmly off the windows instead of creating cold reflections. Her footsteps echoed on the marble steps as she approached the front door. Before she could knock, it swung open, revealing Mrs. Cheney's familiar face. "Welcome back, dear," the nurse said warmly, drawing Lucy into a brief hug. "He's in the conservatory." Lucy's heart thundered in her chest as she made her way through the familiar corridors. Everything looked both exactly the same and completely different, like a photograph that had softened around the edges. Fresh flowers filled every vase, their sweet fragrance mixing with the morning air that drifted through open windows. When she reached the conservatory doors, she had to pause to steady herself. Through the glass panels, she could see that the space had been transformed. The stark glass enclosure that had once dominated the room, Ethan's self-imposed prison, was gone. Sunlight streamed freely through the conservatory roof, dancing across potted plants and creating rainbow patterns on the floor. In place of the cage stood a simple wooden table, its surface covered with papers and sketches. Beside it was a wheelchair, and in it sat Ethan. He looked different, thinner, more fragile than she remembered. The hard edges that had once defined him had softened, like a statue weathered by gentle rain. But his eyes, those striking grey eyes, were clearer than ever as they met hers. "I knew you'd come," he said softly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Lucy felt tears welling up as she crossed the room to him. Up close, she could see how much the surgery had taken from him. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on the wheelchair's arms, and shadows lurked beneath his eyes. Yet there was a peace in his expression she'd never seen before. "The sketches," she managed to say, gesturing to the papers scattered across the table. "What are they?" Ethan's smile widened slightly as he reached for one of the drawings. "A community garden project. Something to bring life back to the valley." His voice was weaker than she remembered, but his enthusiasm was evident as he showed her the plans. "We'll start here, on the estate grounds. But eventually, I hope to see gardens like this spread throughout Briar Hollow." Lucy studied the detailed drawings, raised beds accessible to wheelchair users, paths wide enough for mobility aids, areas designed for children to learn about growing food. It was beautiful, thoughtful, and entirely unlike the cold corporate projects she'd expected from Ethan Holloway. "How long?" she asked, her voice breaking. She didn't need to finish the question. Ethan set the sketch down carefully. "The doctors say a few months if I'm lucky." He reached for her hand as she began to cry. "Lucy, look at me." Through her tears, she met his gaze. His grip was gentle but steady as he said, "You can't heal the world by carrying guilt. You have to plant something new." She wiped her eyes with her free hand. "Is that what you're doing? Planting something new?" "I'm trying," he admitted. "The Healing Fund will help families affected by mining accidents. But this is about creating something living, something that grows. Lucy looked around the transformed conservatory. Where the glass cage had once stood, potted seedlings now reached toward the sun. Life was everywhere, in the trailing vines, the budding flowers, the fresh green shoots pushing through rich soil. "Will you show me?" she asked softly. Ethan's face lit up. "I'd like that." Lucy moved behind the wheelchair, her hands finding the familiar handles. Together, they began to explore the paths that wound through the conservatory and out into the estate gardens. Sunlight filtered through the glass roof, creating patterns that shifted and danced as they moved. Ethan pointed out different areas as they went. Here would be a butterfly garden, there a vegetable patch for the local food bank. Each plan was carefully thought out, designed to bring beauty and sustenance to their struggling community. "The roses," Lucy said suddenly, remembering the carefully tended bushes she'd once cared for. "Are they still—" "See for yourself," Ethan directed, gesturing toward a sunny corner. The rose garden had transformed from its former regimented rows into something wild and wonderful. Climbing varieties sprawled up trellises, while bush roses created clouds of color at varying heights. The air was heavy with their perfume. "They're beautiful," Lucy whispered. "They grew better when I stopped trying to control them." Ethan said quietly, "Like everything else in my life." They continued their tour through the gardens, pausing often to examine a particular plant or discuss plans for different areas. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air around them. Birds darted between the trees, and butterflies danced among the flowers. When they reached a small patio overlooking the valley, Lucy stopped the wheelchair. The view stretched out before them. The town below, the mountains beyond, everything bathed in golden light. It was the same view she'd seen from her guest room all those months ago, but now she saw it with different eyes. "Thank you," Ethan said suddenly. "For what?" "For coming back, for showing me that redemption was possible." He turned slightly in his chair to look up at her. "For teaching me that love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to give it anyway." Lucy felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't entirely sad. She moved to stand beside his wheelchair, their shoulders touching lightly as they gazed out over the valley together. In the garden below, roses climbed toward the sky, no longer contained by walls of glass, but free to grow as they were meant to, wild and beautiful and perfectly imperfect. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above them, creating shifting patterns on the ground at their feet. In that moment, Lucy understood what Ethan had meant about planting something new. Sometimes healing couldn't erase the past, but it could transform it into something unexpected and lovely, like wildflowers growing in the cracks of old walls, or love blooming in the most unlikely of places. The afternoon mellowed into evening, painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Lucy had brought a light dinner out to the rose garden, simple sandwiches and fresh lemonade, and they sat together watching the sun's slow descent behind the mountains. The roses around them released their sweetest perfume in the cooling air, their petals glowing like stained glass in the sunset light. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of birds settling in for the night, and somewhere far below, the town of Briar Hollow was coming alive with evening activities. Ethan sat in his wheelchair, looking more at peace than Lucy had ever seen him. The rigid tension that had once defined his posture had softened, replaced by something gentler, more human. His scars caught the golden light, but they no longer seemed like marks of shame, just part of his story, like the weathered stones in an old garden wall. "You're staring," he said softly, a hint of amusement in his voice. Lucy blushed, caught in her observation. "I was just thinking how different you look now." "Different good or different bad?" Different free, she answered honestly. Ethan nodded slowly, his hands fidgeting with something in his lap that Lucy couldn't quite see. I've been thinking about that word a lot lately. Freedom. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When you first came here, I thought I was trapped by these walls, by this body, by my past, but the real prison was in my mind. Lucy reached over and squeezed his hand. We were both trapped back then. Me by anger, you by guilt. And now? His grey eyes met hers, searching. Now I think we've both learned to leave the door open. A soft smile touched Ethan's lips, and he seemed to come to a decision. With slightly trembling hands, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, one that Lucy recognized immediately. It was the same box that had held the ring from their legal arrangement months ago, the one that had sealed their business deal in tears and desperation. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as Ethan opened the box. The ring inside caught the last rays of sunlight, but this time it didn't look like a chain. It looked like a promise. Lucy Ann Doyle. Ethan's voice was quiet but steady. Would you marry me? For real this time? She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes as he continued. Not for money, he said. Not for pity. Just so I can spend whatever time I have left beside someone who saw past my scars and forgave me when I couldn't forgive myself. Tears spilled down Lucy's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice, it came out as a whisper. Yes. Yes, I will. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, but his smile was radiant. Good, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Then, with a glimmer of his old, dry humor, he added, Now it's official. The monster gets his happy ending after all. Lucy laughed through her tears, the sound mixing with the sudden pealing of church bells from the valley below. The evening angelus rang out across the distance, clear and sweet, as if blessing their moment. She moved her chair closer to his wheelchair and gently laid her head on his shoulder. Ethan's arm came around her, and they sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. The first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the roses released their nighttime fragrance into the cooling air. In that moment, Lucy realized something profound. The walls that had once seemed to trap them both had transformed into something else entirely. The glass cage was gone, the anger had melted away, and the guilt had loosened its grip. What remained was something beautiful and unexpected, like roses breaking through concrete, or love blooming in the most unlikely of gardens. The church bells faded into the twilight, leaving behind a peaceful silence. Neither Lucy nor Ethan felt any need to move or speak. For the first time since either could remember, they felt completely, utterly free. They sat together in the deepening dusk, watching as lights began to twinkle on in the valley below. The ring on Lucy's finger caught the last rays of sunset, no longer a symbol of arrangement, but a token of something far more precious, forgiveness, redemption, and love that had grown wild and beautiful in the garden of second chances. The autumn mornings grew crisper as weeks passed at the Holloway estate. Lucy settled into a gentle rhythm with Ethan, their days flowing one into another like a peaceful stream. Each morning, she would wheel him to the conservatory where sunlight streamed through the glass, casting rainbow patterns across their breakfast table. She read to him daily, her voice bringing stories to life as his body grew weaker. Sometimes it was poetry. Wordsworth was his favorite. Other times newspaper articles about the Holloway Healing Fund's latest projects. But most often, she read from her father's worn Bible, the pages soft and familiar beneath her fingers. Ethan would close his eyes, listening intently as ancient words of comfort filled the room. In the kitchen, Lucy learned to perfect his favorite potato and leek soup, the one his mother used to make. More pepper, he'd tease, though they both knew she'd gotten the recipe exactly right weeks ago. She'd pretend to be annoyed, but her heart would warm at his playful smile, so different from the guarded man she'd first met. The roses thrived under Lucy's care, even as autumn's chill crept in. She'd clip fresh blooms to place by his bedside, their sweet fragrance a reminder of summer's warmth. Ethan would watch her tend the garden from his wheelchair, offering advice about pruning and soil care that she suspected he'd learned just to have something to teach her. His health declined steadily, but there was a growing peace about him that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The bitter edge that had once characterized his words had mellowed into gentle wisdom. Even as his body failed him, his spirit seemed to grow stronger, brighter. "You know what I've learned?" he said one afternoon as Lucy adjusted his blankets. "Sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as our worst nightmares." She paused, looking at him questioningly. "If I hadn't been trapped in that glass cage," he continued, "I would never have been here when you broke in that day." Lucy smiled, remembering how terrified she'd been. "You mean when I so gracefully knocked over your favorite rose bush?" "That rose bush needed pruning anyway." He chuckled softly, then grew serious. "You saved me, Lucy. Not from death. That was always coming. But from dying, bitter and alone." On his final morning, Lucy sensed something different in the air. A stillness, like the world was holding its breath. She helped him dress warmly, his favorite sweater, the soft grey one that matched his eyes, and wheeled him out to the wide porch that overlooked the valley. The pre-dawn air was crisp, but not too cold. Lucy wrapped them both in thick blankets, tucking the edges carefully around Ethan's legs. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to fade, waiting for the sun. The sky gradually lightened, painting itself in delicate shades of pink and gold. Mist lay in the valley below, like a silver blanket, and birds began their morning songs one by one. "Do you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his voice full of wonder. "It's the world waking up." Lucy squeezed his hand gently, feeling the weakness in his grip, but the warmth still there. "You helped it wake up," she replied softly. "Look at all you've done. The healing fund, the community gardens, all those families you've helped." He smiled faintly. "All because a brave young woman dared to break into a monster's cage." "There was never any monster," Lucy said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just a man who needed to forgive himself." The first ray of sunlight crested the hills, setting the morning mist aglow. Ethan's breath caught slightly at the beauty of it, then released in a contented sigh. His head settled gently against Lucy's shoulder, and his hand relaxed in hers. "You're free now," Lucy whispered as the morning light filled the porch, transforming everything it touched into gold. She held him as the sun rose fully over the hills, her tears falling silently as birdsong filled the air. The world was waking up, just as he'd said, and somewhere in that awakening, Ethan had found his final freedom. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, and spring blossomed once again over Briar Hollow. 1 year had passed since Ethan's departure, but his legacy flourished in ways few could have imagined. The Holloway estate, once a symbol of isolation and tragedy, had transformed into a beacon of hope for the community. The Holloway Garden Foundation sprawled across the estate's vast grounds, its gardens bursting with life and purpose. Where thorny undergrowth once crept, organized plots of vegetables, herbs, and flowers now thrived under careful tending. The glass conservatory, Ethan's former sanctuary, had become the heart of the foundation's operations, its transparent walls now housing seedlings and dreams instead of secrets and shame. Lucy moved through the gardens daily, her practical boots leaving temporary impressions in the soft soil. She wore simple clothing, usually jeans and a work shirt, but the gold band on her finger caught the sunlight, a constant reminder of the love that had changed everything. Sometimes she'd pause in her work to touch it, remembering Ethan's smile on that final morning. The foundation employed dozens of miners' widows and their children, providing not just work but healing. In the therapy garden, designed specifically for rehabilitation, former miners with injuries worked alongside grief counselors. The gentle task of nurturing plants helped mend both bodies and spirits. Lucy had insisted on this program, knowing how both physical and emotional wounds needed tending. "Mrs. Peterson, those tomatoes are coming along beautifully," Lucy called out to an elderly woman carefully staking plants in the vegetable garden. The woman, whose husband had died in the same explosion as Lucy's father, beamed with pride. "Never thought I'd find joy in growing things," Mrs. Peterson replied, her weathered hands gentle with the green stems. Tom would have loved to see this place. The housing complex, built on what was once unused Holloway land, provided comfortable homes for 20 families. The modern apartments featured wide windows and private balcony gardens, ensuring that even those who lived there could nurture their own small piece of earth. Lucy had worked closely with architects to design spaces that promoted both independence and community. Every morning, Lucy walked through the gardens before the day began in earnest. She'd stop to check on new plantings, chat with early rising residents, and ensure everything was in order. The transformation still amazed her, how pain and loss had somehow sprouted into something beautiful. This particular spring morning, she prepared for the foundation's annual open house. Visitors would soon arrive from all over the region to see what had grown from the ashes of tragedy. The estate's gates, once forbidding, stood permanently open, welcoming all who sought healing or hope. "The roses are particularly lovely this year," commented Maria, one of the foundation's counselors, as she helped Lucy arrange chairs for the morning's orientation. Lucy smiled, glancing at the climbing roses that covered the conservatory's exterior. "They're stubborn things," she said. "Like forgiveness, they grow whether you're ready or not." As visitors began to arrive, Lucy took her place at the entrance to the garden path. She'd given this tour countless times, but each telling felt important, like planting seeds that might bloom in unknown ways. "Welcome to the Holloway Garden Foundation," she began, her voice clear and strong. "These gardens you see around you were grown from forgiveness. They're proof that beauty can rise from our deepest wounds if we're brave enough to tend it." She led them through the grounds, sharing not just the foundation's programs, but its heart. At the therapy garden, she explained how working with plants could heal both body and soul. In the community kitchen, where produce from the gardens was prepared for residents and local food banks, she described how nourishment came in many forms. The visitors' faces softened as they walked, their initial curiosity turning to understanding. Many had heard the stories of the mining accident, of the reclusive billionaire, of the unlikely love that had birthed this place. But seeing it in person, touching the roses and meeting the people whose lives had been changed, made the miracle tangible. After the tours concluded and the visitors departed, Lucy made her way to the small cemetery on the estate's eastern hill. Ethan's grave lay beneath a spreading magnolia tree, its pink-tinged blooms scenting the air with sweet perfume. The headstone was simple, bearing only his name and dates, with a single line beneath, "Love broke the cage." Lucy settled on the bench beside the grave, drawing out the worn Bible she'd brought the day she first entered the mansion. Its pages, dog-eared and marked, contained both her father's notes and Ethan's later observations. She opened to one of their favorite passages and began to read aloud. "Love is patient, love is kind." She read, her voice carrying on the spring breeze. "It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." The words, once strange to Ethan, had become his comfort in his final months. She remembered how he'd listened intently as she read, his skepticism gradually giving way to a quiet faith that sustained him to the end. As she closed the Bible, the church bells in the valley began to ring, their clear tones floating up the hillside. The sound transported her back to that evening in the rose garden, when Ethan had offered her a ring and a real marriage, not born of desperation but of love. Lucy touched her wedding band, smiling softly. "Please marry me," she whispered, echoing his words from that night. Then, answering as she had then, "I already did." Standing, she brushed grass from her jeans and took one last look at the magnolia-shaded grave. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the cemetery's peaceful grounds. In the distance, the glass conservatory caught the light, its walls no longer containing but reflecting, sending prisms of colour dancing across the gardens. Lucy walked back toward the foundation buildings, where new groups of visitors would soon arrive. The gravel path crunched beneath her feet, and overhead, birds called to each other in the fresh spring air. The conservatory rose before her, its transparent walls transformed from a cage into a cathedral of light and grace, much like the heart that had once beat within it. Each step took her further into the future Ethan had helped create, one where pain could be transformed, where forgiveness could bloom, and where love could break any cage. The sun spilled across the glass walls, setting them ablaze with morning light, as if in blessing of all that had grown from a desperate girl's plea and a broken man's redemption. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to. See you again, subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.